Cognition, an Introduction, Memory. I'm Benjamin Miss. This chapter will discuss the different types of memory and the related mechanisms in the brain. The study of memory shows a clear link between what is happening in the brain and what we experience in our mind. Before beginning this chapter, test your memory. Think about a penny, a common object you've seen thousands of times. Now draw the front of it from memory. Have you ever almost remembered something? You stand there almost remembering someone's name or a word you know that you know. It's right there, but not quite. I've stood in class, describing a concept, hoping that the name of the concept would come to me before the students realized I'd forgotten the word. This is referred to as the tip of the tongue phenomenon, and it illustrates the mysterious nature of memory. How can we know something, but also not know it? We can feel that we have the answer, or some bit of knowledge, but due to what is called retrieval failure, we are unable to access that piece of information. Putting information into our memory involves encoding, which means converting sensory information into a pattern of neuron firing. Storage takes place in the brain, and it is the maintenance of that information. Retrieval is our ability to get that information back out and make use of it. Many things can cause retrieval failure, such as missing a cue that was present at learning, or interference from other kinds of information. As much as we know about memory, there are still many things we don't quite understand. Types of memory include sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Each of these types of memory can be further divided, as in this image. The simplest type of memory to consider is called sensory memory, and it is basically the length of time information stays in your senses but is not processed. When we see, hear, or touch something, it can take time for the information to be processed by our brain to allow for perception. We certainly don't process all of the information available to our senses. We'd be overloaded. It can take a moment to realize some information is important to attend to, and this information may still briefly exist in our sensory memory before it disappears forever. The first major modern investigation took place around 1960, when George Sperling developed a task to measure the amount of time your visual system held on to information you did not process. Think about how much information passes through your senses but is ignored. If you were to enter an unfamiliar environment with your eyes closed, and then open your eyes for 1 second and then close your eyes, how much will you remember? If you've ever seen the TV show Psych, you've seen the main character rewind his memory and zoom in on things that were in his field of vision. This is absolutely not how memory works. If you do not process it, it is gone. That is one of the reasons eyewitness accounts are responsible for so many false convictions. Our memory for specifics, like what color a car was or what someone was wearing, is generally poor. The visual component of sensory memory is called iconic memory. Sperling created an experiment where he showed letters on a screen and asked people to remember them. The image was flashed for about 50 milliseconds, and people could remember about 4 or 5 letters from a 3-letter by 3-letter matrix, like this. However, Sperling then taught his subjects to respond to a high, middle, or low tone and give only that row. Interestingly, when the tone was played after the array was shown, accuracy for the row requested was high. This meant that people were storing all the information in their iconic sensory memory, but that the information disappeared quickly if it was not attended to. Sean Spencer, the fake detective from the TV show Psych, would not be storing all of the information in his sensory memory. He would have to be processing every visual scene and storing all of that information in order to function in the way described in the show, an impossible task. What is often called photographic memory has never been shown to exist. The extremely rare case of hyperthymesia is related to perfect autobiographical memory. So people who experience it are able to remember things about their lives but their ability to learn information is not enhanced. And their ability to process sensory information is no different than yours or mine. The other major types of sensory memory are echoic and haptic. Echoic memory exists in our auditory system. It fades after 3 to 4 seconds, lasting far longer than iconic memory, and is important in analyzing and understanding speech. You may have experienced how echoic memory works when having a conversation with someone you weren't quite paying attention to, and then they ask you a question. You realize they asked you a question and quickly try to think about what they just said. Often, you will be successful because the information is still stored in echoic memory. Haptic memory is related to our sense of touch. It decays after about 2 seconds and is important in temporarily maintaining information while we are performing physical tasks. It tracks both the physical sensation in our skin and the kinesthetic information related to the position of our body. The next type of memory refers to the interplay between the information we take in and information that is permanently stored. There are many things we do throughout the day where we are temporarily processing and acting on information. This type of memory is often called short-term memory or working memory, though those terms don't quite mean the same thing. Working memory is a term that refers to the information you are actively working on, and it includes the process of short-term memory. Short-term memory decays over approximately 30 seconds if you're not paying attention to it, and it has a fairly small capacity. Debate as to whether it can hold on average 7 pieces of information, suggested by Miller, or 4 pieces of information, suggested by Cohen, depends on how we're thinking about memory. Since the language you speak can have an influence on short-term memory capacity, it is most likely that we are chunking most information. If you're shown a list of numbers to memorize, you will pair many of them. The string 1045198 might be broken up into 10, 45, 19, and 8. This process would happen automatically, without our thinking about it, but it makes it hard to measure our actual capacity. Working memory is monitored by the central executive and contains the phonological loop, visuospatial sketchpad, and episodic buffer. The phonological loop handles auditory and language information. The visuospatial sketchpad focuses on a location and visualization of images, and the episodic buffer is holding information on what is currently happening. Our long-term memory refers to information that is approximately permanently stored. Obviously, we do lose information over time if it is no longer useful to us, but in most cases, long-term memory lasts indefinitely. There are 4 important components of long-term memory. When discussing our knowledge of ourselves, or our knowledge of information, we are talking about a type of memory called explicit memory. Explicit memory is also called declarative memory and is divided into subtypes called episodic memory and semantic memory. Episodic memory is your knowledge of your own experiences, and semantic memory is your knowledge of facts and information. Episodic memory is sometimes referred to as autobiographical memory. The other major types of memory are not about information. It's called implicit memory and contains our knowledge for physical skills, called procedural memory, and for automatic responses involving classical and emotional conditioning. Procedural memory contains your ability to drive a car or ride a bike. If you drive, you might be able to think back to the learning process. It was difficult, and you probably forgot things, like which pedal was the brake, how to put the car in gear, and when to use the emergency brake. You might have turned on the wipers instead of the turn signal. Yet now this process has become automatic, and you do not have to think at all about the process of driving. You might have seen how automatic this experience is, perhaps having a conversation on a road trip, and missing a turn, because you were not paying conscious attention to the drive. In regards to conditioning, the focus here will be on classical conditioning. This is the famous example of Pavlov's dogs, where the Russian scientist realized that the dogs were salivating before being presented food. They had learned the experimental process and knew when food was coming before it was presented. Certain types of classical conditioning happen after single trials, such as taste aversion. If you've eaten something that made you sick, seeing it or thinking about it could be enough to cause nausea. This is likely related to emotional conditioning, a powerful form of memory that keeps us from doing something that hurt us in the past. What is particularly interesting about these four types of long-term memory, semantic, episodic, procedural, and conditioned, is that we can see that they function separately in the brain. We can also see how our brain deals with working memory in temporary storage. Much of this information comes from experimentation, though early breakthroughs in understanding memory came from the study of amnesic patients. Amnesia. Amnesia is a partial or total loss of memory. There are two main types of amnesia, retrograde and anterograde. When most people think of amnesia, they imagine a person who cannot remember their past, like the character Jason Bourne from the movie The Bourne Identity. Jason Bourne experienced a traumatic event and could not remember anything about his life before awakening on a shipping vessel. He seemed surprised by his ability to speak numerous languages and his physical skills. This type of amnesia is rare and usually related to brain damage, though there are some reported cases of psychosomatic amnesia, which is loss of memory after a traumatic event with no clear physiological cause. Another famous example is Scott Bolzan, a former football player and businessman. After a slip and fall accident, he lost his memory of his life before the accident. He also lost his understanding of relationships, and he could not recall major historical events. Brain scans later showed that he had severe damage to both his right and left temporal lobes, as well as reduced blood flow. Interestingly, some neurologists doubted that Bolzan's memory loss was real. In general, older memories are more resistant to loss than recent memories. In speaking to someone with Alzheimer's disease, for instance, you may find they can discuss their childhood with fluency, but they have no recollection of their own children or grandchildren. Due to the difference in Scott's case, the neurologists had difficulty believing him, but most neurologists will also note that no two amnesia cases are alike. The second type of amnesia, anterograde, is more common and easier to understand. Anterograde amnesia happens when someone has damage to both of their hippocampi. You have one hippocampus in your right temporal lobe and one hippocampus in the left temporal lobe. If both are damaged through brain injury, stroke, or other condition, a person could lose the ability to form new long-term memories. This case has historically been exemplified by Henry Molaison, who underwent surgery in 1953 at the age of 27 in an attempt to control his seizures. The frequency and severity of his seizures left him unable to function, and the neurosurgeon William Beatrice Stowe removed large portions of Henry's temporal lobes. After the surgery, Molaison had difficulty remembering his previous years of his life and was unable to form new memories. He could remember information in working memory if he repeated it to himself, but he would forget meeting someone nearly immediately after the person left the room. Over time, he did seem able to add some new semantic information to his memory, but he could remember nothing of his life since the surgery. A combination of anterograde and retrograde amnesia affected composer and musician Clive Wearing, who suffered a viral infection of his brain that left him unable to form new memories and also unable to hold information in short-term memory beyond standard memory decay. Wearing feels as if he is continually waking up, and that the present version of himself is the only real version of himself. Before his illness, Waring was a highly successful musician and musical director. After his illness, he seemed trapped in the immediate present, with memory for little besides his love for his wife and his children. It was eventually discovered that Waring could still read music and even successfully conduct a choir, paying attention to each part and demonstrating a high level of competence. Lessons from amnesia tell us that no case of amnesia is the same and can even give us insights into memory. It was Henry Molaison's case that first implicated the medial temporal lobe and hippocampus in episodic memory and semantic memory. Experiments performed by Molaison demonstrated that working memory and procedural memory could still be intact and must be separate in the brain. Clive Waring suffered more widespread brain damage than Molaison, yet he seemed to still possess strong memory for emotional experiences. Pain, being an emotional experience, can create memories in those that cannot remember specifics. One patient, after being pricked by a hidden needle, avoids situations related to the hidden needle experience. The patient would make up a reason to explain the behavior. This is called confabulation, and it is often associated with brain injury and memory loss, but it is something that anyone can do. It is an automatic process where a person fills in gaps in memory with what they imagine to be true. Memory in the brain. The computer metaphor for the mind is a great start for understanding how the types of memory function in the brain. In dividing memory into the three components of sensory, working, and long-term, the computer can be a good model. Computer input methods represent sensory memory. The active computer memory, or RAM, represents working memory. And the computer's hard drive represents long-term memory. The computer model fails, however, when we consider the complexity of working memory and long-term memory. While a computer can hold a massive spreadsheet in RAM while we scroll through it and focus on various parts, we are limited in the amount of information we can hold in our minds. We don't remember everything, regularly clearing out irrelevant information and focusing on information linked with our emotional states. As noted, working memory and short-term memory are often used synonymously. Short-term memory, however, is best thought of as the process of holding information in memory for a brief period of time. If it is unused, it will usually decay in about 30 seconds, meaning you will no longer be able to access it. Working memory contains that process, as well as whatever information you are holding in your active memory. You may be trying to solve a problem, turning the information over in your mind. As long as you are thinking about it, you can retain the information, but once you stop, it will likely disappear. This process is heavily taking place in your prefrontal cortex, which would contain the central executive component from the Baddeley and Hitch model of working memory. This central executive is monitoring and regulating the three subsystems: the visuospatial sketchpad, the phonological loop, and the episodic buffer. The visuospatial sketchpad is associated with tasks that involve visualizing and manipulating physical objects in your mind, and it makes sense it should involve right hemisphere parietal areas. The phonological loop may incorporate Broca's area in the inferior frontal gyrus and Wernicke's area in the superior temporal gyrus, as well as the anterior cingulate cortex. The episodic buffer tends to show increased activity in the prefrontal and parietal areas. In most working memory tasks, disruption of the connections between the prefrontal and parietal areas can cause task failure. There is no specific line between the processes of working memory and long-term memory. You've probably experienced this yourself when studying. Some information sticks better than others. It is likely related to depth of processing, which is the amount of time and effort you put into engaging with and thinking about the material. As noted, if you can relate information to yourself or an experience you've had, it is easier to remember. This is due to the different types of long-term memory. When we discuss long-term memory, we consider the various functions of semantic, episodic, procedural, and conditioned memory. The brain handles each of these types of memory differently, but there is a great deal of overlap. The brain does not contain memory at only one point. There was an idea popular in the 1960s that memory relied on a certain cells that would be activated and then identify the thing in our memory. This was called the grandmother cell because of the example that if you saw your grandmother, neurons would activate until it finally activated this one cell that let you know your grandmother was present. More recently, a study showed a patient undergoing brain surgery had a neuron that responded strongly to images of the actress Jennifer Aniston and weakly to almost all other things. This does not mean that cell is necessary for the person to experience Jennifer Aniston. However, that cell may respond so strongly to her image due to a combination of characteristics. Losing that cell would not mean that patient lost the ability to recognize or know who the actress was. It is far more likely, however, that we have distributed processing. Memory is not reliant on change in a single cell, but rather a pattern of activation among a large number of cells. This is why it is so difficult to localize a single memory in the brain. For instance, you may meet your friend's significant other. Instead of creating changes to a few cells to denote this is a new person, it makes more sense to encode the new memory by linking it with other patterns of activation. You harness already existing patterns of neural firing that contain information about your friend, and perhaps other people your friend's significant other reminds you of. Thousands of neurons are firing in the same frequency, tied together to give you the full experience of that person. You encode all the information about them tied together, but you may have failures. Failures happen for many reasons. Some pieces of information may not be as strongly encoded as others. Memory relies on cues. Have you ever seen a fellow student or coworker at the supermarket and forgotten their name? Or it takes a moment to remember where you know them from. We are missing context, which assists our memory. Many people don't pay as much attention to someone's name as they do to what the person looks like. It is often easier to remember what someone says because it is woven into conversation, but a name is separate and requires special care. For our specific types of long-term memory, we can suggest where certain centers of function are in the brain, but there is a great deal of overlap, and these areas could cover a large amount of brain tissue. Episodic memory, your knowledge of your own experiences, is heavily tied to the hippocampus, embedded deep in the temporal lobe. Studies on patients like Henry Molaison have shown that the hippocampus is required in forming these types of memories. Children who have damage to their hippocampus at a young age seem to be able to exhibit typical learning for information, but have no memory for the learning. It is believed that semantic memory, our memory for facts, is stored in the medial temporal lobe around the hippocampus. There is debate about whether the hippocampus is necessary for semantic memory. Procedural memory relies on deep brain structures around and below the thalamus called the basal ganglia, and another major structure called the cerebellum. The basal ganglia are functionally defined, meaning they are separate but have strong connections between them and seem to work in concert relating to movement. Both of these areas are implicated in movement, with the basal ganglia also implicated in movement disorders that have memory consequences, such as Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. The cerebellum has traditionally been associated with movement, but recent research suggests it is heavily involved in memory. Currently, the cerebellum is believed to be the place where the engram is stored. The engram is the physical place where memory exists. Emotional conditioning relies on the amygdala, which sits anterior to the hippocampus in the temporal lobe. Due to this close connection, emotion has a powerful effect on our memory. The stronger the emotional response, the stronger the memory. Our most intense memories involve love, loss, excitement, and fear. Situations that cause these emotions are generally important for our survival and reproduction, and seem to be prioritized. The next section will focus on this type of memory and how it can lead to problems. Memory and post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is tied to memory because it is the memory of the traumatic event which causes the intense stress response when a sufferer is exposed to similar circumstances to those that caused the PTSD. The classic example is the soldier returning from war. The trench warfare of the First World War, where opposing armies might be hunkered down in ditches dozens of yards away from each other for weeks and months, created a breeding ground for PTSD. The constant threat of battle, the unrelenting bombardment of exploding shells and whizzing bullets meant death could come at any moment. The soldier was under constant stress. An abnormally close explosion, or witnessing a friend's death, could cause a PTSD response. PTSD is a natural cognitive response to intense stress. Notice the circumstances described. Generally, the environment is already stressful, and then a specific event occurs that causes a rapid rewiring of the brain. The amygdala, responsible for emotion, is next to the hippocampus, and thereby has a great deal of influence on memory. Danger is important to remember, and in order to improve the chances of survival, the brain creates a connection between environmental stimuli and the stress event. The war ends. The soldier returns home, and yet now environmental stimuli related to that battlefield, such as thunder, backfiring cars, loud crowds, or other unexpected noises, could bring that soldier emotionally back to the terror of battle. That neural connection between the environment and the fight for survival has been known to haunt soldiers for the rest of their lives, making it difficult to function as they return to their peacetime lives. Treatments include psychotherapy to help them deal with the trauma they experienced, as well as medications to reduce the stress response. Any stressful experience can cause PTSD, though physical threats such as assaults are common causes. Not all individuals are equally at risk. It appears that the function of the amygdala and hippocampus differ between people, and those differences lead to different levels of risk. PTSD is not a single thing, but rather a term used for a cluster of symptoms. Treatment and emotional support are important in helping sufferers return to healthy functioning. Mnemonics and other memory tricks. You may have watched quiz show winners and wondered how they know so much. Well, they certainly must be intelligent. They also have enhanced their natural abilities through the use of mnemonics. Think about how you can use what you're learning about memory and cognition to improve your learning. If you need to remember facts, such as for anatomy class, you can put the information into a story about yourself. If you work out, you could name the muscles you're using for each exercise. A list of facts can be hard to remember, but you remember it better when you harness a rhyme or story or new word. A famous one you might have learned as a child was the fictional name Roy G. Biv, which represents the colors of the rainbow in order: R for red, O for orange, and so on. I remember learning SAT words and finding the word avarice with a picture of the character Ava, who is hoarding her rice so she doesn't have to share. Avarice is like greed. We use the word voice to remember the difference between operant and classical conditioning. Voluntary operant, involuntary classical, though the E here is just to complete the word with no meaning. If you have to memorize lists, using mnemonics is extremely helpful. The study of anatomy has many of these, including this one for memorizing the names in order of cranial nerves. On old Olympus tippy top, a Finn, a German, viewed a hop. The first letter of each word corresponds to a cranial nerve. The function of the cranial nerves is represented by the sentence, "Some say marry money, but my big brother says big brains matter more." The first letter of each word is either S for sensory, M for motor, or B for both. What's important is you find mnemonics that work for you. When you have to memorize something, it is useful to create a rhyme or an acronym that helps you remember. This can take a few minutes, but overall it saves a lot of time and improves your performance. If you want to learn faster and study less, then how you organize the information plays a big part. Often, we aren't taught to do this. Fortunately, many topics you have to remember already have mnemonics. When talking about memory interference, students once shared in class the mnemonic PORN. The letters stand for proactive old, retroactive new. This means that proactive interference is caused by old information, and retroactive interference is caused by new information. An example of this is when studying. If you first study for your anatomy class and then your physiological psychology class, there are two things that can happen. Learning physiological psychology information can interfere with something you learned about the brain from your anatomy class. Since you learned anatomy first, this is retroactive interference. If the anatomy lesson interferes with what you later learned in physiological psychology, since you learned the anatomy first, this is proactive interference. Test yourself. Now that you've read and learned some new information, it's time to close the book, turn off the computer, turn to a blank page, and write. Write from memory. Everything you remember about the lesson. Write terms, definitions, and questions. Does this sound odd? To many people, this technique is counterintuitive. In an article in a highly influential journal Science, Karpicki and Blunt, 2011, laid out their research on this topic. They had some students participate in a condition where they had 2 study sessions, study, study, and another group of students was given a session where they studied and were then tested, study, test. After a week, the study test group retained significantly more information than the study group. The key here is that studying is a fundamentally different process than testing. Testing involves retrieval, and learning, encoding, does not. You don't really know what's in your memory until you try to retrieve it. Not only does testing improve long-term retention, it also tells you what you didn't get into your memory the first time. Testing is good, and having lots of tests in a class is beneficial to your learning. False memory. If this discussion doesn't ruin our faith in memory, nothing will. Memory is fragile, and remember bits and pieces. Ever have an argument with a loved one about something that happened, and you both remember it differently? It is possible that both people are correct, and also incorrect. First, our memory is generally poor. Think about what a penny looks like. Which way is Lincoln facing? What are the words in the front? And what are the words on the back? Think about other currency. You have viewed and handled these things countless times, yet you remember only fragments. Consider what happened when Nickerson and Adams asked people to draw a penny. You can go ahead and try this too. The image here contains examples of what some people drew. People could not remember what it said, where the words and numbers were, or what direction the president faced. Certainly, this is an indictment of our memory. You can remember what you had for breakfast today, but what about last week? You can remember the details of today, such as how you picked out your clothes this morning, but the same details about yesterday and previous days have faded. Most information is simply not important, and we remove it from our memory. Now consider another question. You can recall what a penny looks like, but can you recognize a real one? If you were asked to select the real penny from a sample of pennies, would you be able to tell which one is correct? Nickerson and Adams asked people to look at a drawing of a penny and say whether it was accurate. Here are some of their drawings. Recall is different from recognition, with most people finding recognition easier. You may not recall all the names of your favorite actors or characters, but you can recognize the real from the fake. With the images here, can you recognize which penny is the real penny? This task is exceedingly difficult. Many subjects liked G and I and agreed that those drawings were accurate. 8 subjects were shown the real penny, A, and only half of them agreed it was accurate. We will understand what happened here, where we would discuss false memory. Memory is also vulnerable to suggestion. It can change after something happened. The memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus has performed countless experiments demonstrating just how poor eyewitness testimony is. Many of her subjects argued that they can remember events from their childhood that were made up by the researchers. She also showed that memory can change after the fact. If shown a video of a car crash, the question can influence the memory of what happened. People remembered broken glass when there was none. They estimated the speed of impact as higher when the experimenter used the word smashed than when the experimenter used the word contacted. If a police officer asks a witness if the subject was wearing a blue coat, the person may later remember the subject's coat as blue. Even further, Loftus showed it was possible that a small number of therapists were implanting false memories in their patients, causing memories of abuse that never happened. For that research, she has unfortunately received a great deal of hate mail. Ever have the experience of thinking about someone and then they called? I would suggest that you might have answered their call and then remembered thinking about them. Our minds are terrible at memory and cannot be trusted. When you have that disagreement with your loved one, it is best to say that how you both remember things is okay, and perhaps talk about something else. I hope you enjoyed our discussion about memory. Thank you, and I look forward to future topics.